Chapter 1 of Civil Dusk by Nicole R. Ordway. The sun's last blaze of glorious rays branched out over the floundering boat and across the rollicking ocean. Hugh could almost hear the celestial orb wailing for salvation, or that might have been the wind kicking up over the deck rails. Unlike the sunrises on the other side of the island, the western water's sunsets had a harsh character. Brisk and cold, and with sunlight jagged like the gnarled twigs of a 1,000-year-old lightning-struck crab-apple tree, this sky was more often than not the storm-bringer. Tonight would be yet another example of fine Orcadian weather. Reluctantly, Hugh Reed turned the prow of his little boat toward Rousey's stony shore. He'd been out too late too many times before, and had since grown accustomed to yielding to the whim of the weather. The early March squalls were often dangerous affairs that too frequently damaged property and threatened the lives of the hardy men and women who made their living on the water. There were signs for their coming, sure, but by the time one recognized them, there was usually little time for anything more than a cold-nerved rush to safe harborage. As Hugh neatly wound his line around his reel, he watched the sky with a wary eye. The old-timers who still whispered in fear of the mysteries of Orkney's ghosts and fairies spoke at this time of the mither of the sea. Hugh rolled his eyes, reflecting on how reverent Grey Sigurd had become at the pub last Thursday. Put a few pints of the Orkney brewery's latest craft in the man, and when a March Hushel picks up, he's the first to start in on the story of the Vortully, the fabled battle between the mither of the sea and Terran. The summer goddess's return brings warmth to the seas, calm to the skies, and life to all on the islands, which of course puts her at odds with the winter god of furious gales and mountainous waves. Their struggles for dominance were meant to explain the cruelty of the springtime storms. Riding high on the swell of one such wave, Hugh Reed scoffed, as he always did, at the backwardness of such thoughts. Sure, they must have worked in the minds of the ancient Norsemen, who had left their marks of their culture all across the islands. But it was the year 2018, and modern meteorology ought to be the explanation now, and for most Orcadians it seemed to be. However, some still preserved the old ways, for reasons Hugh just couldn't fathom. Was it simply an urge to hold to something traditional in the face of the slow creep of modernism on the islands? Or, he mused when the crucifix cut into his line-sinker caught his eye, could it be faith? Well, whatever the reason for the insanity of those rare Orcadians' suppressed beliefs, he could sympathize with the inclination to assign otherworldly origins to this wild weather. The wind turned suddenly, and its voice indeed seemed to howl angrily in his ears as Hugh pulled his oars hard against the water's rough shoves. The sea was too shallow here, the seaweed-shrouded rocks too close to the surface, to make use of his outboard motor. Even rowing was made tricky, and he grimaced when his starboard oar clacked sharply against something unyielding below the surface. The storm was coming in quickly, which brought some manner of cheer to the fact that his live well remained empty. He'd landed some worthy catches, but nothing that was retainable. Tomorrow he would go to his spot at the lake, Muckle Water, for reliable brown trout, since he'd missed on cod and sea trout today. But first he had to come ashore safely, and when the rain started matting down the wool of his cap, Hugh felt a chill of doubt creep spider-like across his flesh. With a gasping gulp, the water briefly sucked out from under his little craft, giving Hugh a good, heart-stopping glimpse of the rocky ground below him. Just as quickly the sea returned. The fisherman reacted instinctively by pushing his oar handles down hard to lift the blades high out of the surf's reach. Like a gull's plucked wings, the oars looked pinioned thus, and like a soaring seabird, Hugh's one-man boat rode the back of the gathering wave higher and higher. Grim lines traced his face as he focused on bracing for the flight that was sure to come. Higher and higher the water carried him, higher and higher until he began to wonder whether the tips of his oars might pierce the bellies of the steel-gray clouds knitting fiercely together overhead. But then something creaked mightily under his seat, and the swell tipped over into a wave. Amidst froth and roar the sea flung Hugh and his craft along the last distance to the shore. The hull of his little boat crashed noisily upon the scree, sliding and slithering several more yards on momentum alone before coming to rest at an angle on its keel. Hugh didn't have long to marvel at the fact that he still had his stomach and bones intact, before a growl from behind warned of another building wave. With a briskness born of necessity, Hugh shipped his oars and leapt from the boat. His wellies scrambled for traction in the shore's loose, gravel-peppered earth as he wrapped a hauling line over his shoulder and leaned into the tension. Only after his boat was out of danger of being swept back to the sea did he pause to catch his breath. Beginning the walk to where his truck and trailer waited further up the hill, Hugh paused to shake the cold rain out of his eyes. He whisked his hat off, smacking it against the thigh of his waders before plopping it back over his dark hair. The spray of shed water was minimally satisfying, though, as the wool was quickly made sodden once more by the rain. This only surmounted his displeasure of being foolishly caught at sea in a storm at dusk, and he cursed his miscalculation into the crooning wind. The sound of the scolder softened abruptly, so suddenly that Hugh couldn't help but listen. Underneath the clattering rain was a lilting song so beautiful that he glanced around in vain for some sight of the singer. The grey curtain of the wind-whipped rain denied any such discovery, and after shouting once only to have his voice lost in the noise, Hugh gave up the attempt. The song faded back to the forlorn anguish of the storm, and he moved on in his quest to retrieve his truck. Even while he secured his boat on the trailer and started driving home, the memory of that delicate, beautiful song haunted him. How could such a vicious storm make sounds so resplendent? It made no sense. But what made even less sense was the feeling of nostalgia that he just couldn't shake. Somewhere, somewhen, he felt with certainty that he'd heard that song before. In memories before even his earliest childhood recollections, that alluring lullaby lingered. "Well," Hugh commented to his rain-fogged windscreen, "it's nothing a dram of whiskey can't fix." He glanced back once in the mirror to make certain that his boat was still with him after crashing over a rough pothole, but after that his thoughts slid away from the eerie feeling of déjà vu to anticipation of the lamb stew he'd assembled in a crock-pot early that morning. The house must smell so nicely, Hugh mused, his otherwise quiet stomach now grumbling hungrily. Thoughts of singing spooks and warring gods were relegated to the back of his mind as he drove through the stormy evening toward a warm meal and comfortable, if lonely, bed. Gleaming yellow eyes watched his taillights disappear into the rain. Their owner crept from an ancient burial mound's entrance and scowled with a sniffle at the pouring sky. "You couldn't let up now. The feller's off the water. No need to keep pissin' on down like you are," complained the wizened, wrinkled creature. His words had little effect on the weather, though, except perhaps that it only seemed to worsen. He snorted and cut a lengthy piece of reed from the trail beside him. The trow muttered a quick phrase under his breath, then lifted his stunted right leg as though to mount the reed, and by the time his foot was raised hip-height, the reed had transformed into a white horse whose breath steamed into the cool evening air. The trow seated himself astride the yellow-eyed beast and kicked it into action. With a distant echo like hooves clattering against cobblestones, the horse leapt into the air and, under the trow's whispered direction and his calloused hand's gentle pressure, turned its nose in the direction Hugh's truck had gone. That is Chapter 1 of Civil Dusk by Nicole R. Ordway. It is available on Amazon.com or through my website, NicoleROrdway.com. Thank you for listening. Go get the book!